The Truth About George by P.G. Wodehouse. Two men were sitting in the bar parlor of the Angler's Rest, and one of them was telling the other a story.
Biggest I ever saw in my life, fully as large as that.
Dreadful liars some men are.
Fishermen are traditionally careless of the truth.
He wasn't a fisherman. That was our local doctor. He was telling me about his latest case of dropsy. Besides, you must not fall into popular error about fishermen. Tradition has maligned them. I am a fisherman myself, and I have never told a lie in my life.
I could well believe it. What struck me first about this man was the extraordinary childlike candor of his eyes. They were large and brown, honest. I would have bought oil stock from him without a tremor. Suddenly, the door leading into the white, dusty road opened, and a small man with tiny glasses and an anxious expression shot in like a rabbit and had consumed a gin and ginger beer almost before he knew he was there. Having thus refreshed himself, he stood looking at us, seemingly ill at ease.
Nice,
I think he was leading up to telling us that it was a nice day.
It must be very embarrassing for a man with such a painful impediment in his speech to open conversation with strangers. Probably trying to cure himself, like my nephew George. Have I ever told you about my nephew George?
We've only just met.
Young George Mulliner. My name is Mulliner. I will tell you about George's case, in many ways, a rather remarkable one. My nephew George was as nice a young fellow as you would ever wish to meet, but from childhood up, he had been cursed with a terrible stammer. If he had had to earn his living, he would undoubtedly have found this affliction a great handicap. But fortunately, his father had left him a comfortable income, and George spent a not unhappy life, residing in the village where he had been born and passing his days in the usual country sports and his evenings in doing crossword puzzles. By the time he was 30, he knew more about
Eli the prophet, Ra the sun god, and the bird emu
than anybody else in the country except Susan Blake, the vicar's daughter, who had also taken up the solving of crossword puzzles and was the first girl in Worcestershire to figure out the meaning of
Sterine
and
crepuscular.
It was his association with Miss Blake that first turned George's thoughts to a serious endeavor to cure himself of his stammer. Naturally, with their crossword hobby in common, the young people saw a great deal of one another, for George was always looking in at the vicarage to ask,
Do you know a word of 7 letters meaning appertaining to the profession of plumbing?
Susan was just as constant a caller at George's cozy little cottage, being frequently stumped, as girls will be, by
A word of 8 letters, signifying largely used in the manufacture of poppet valves.
The consequence was that one evening, just after she had helped him out of a tight place with the word
Disestablishmentarianism,
the boy suddenly awoke to the truth and realized that she was all the world to him. Or, as he put it to himself from force of habit,
Precious, beloved, darling, much loved, highly esteemed, or valued.
and yet, every time he tried to tell her so, he could get no farther than a sibilant gurgle, which was no more practical use than a hiccup. Something obviously had to be done, and George went to London to see a specialist.
Yes, you were saying, sing it. Many people who are unable to articulate clearly in ordinary speech find themselves lucid and bell-like when they burst into song.
It seemed a good idea to George. He thought for a moment, then threw his head back and shut his eyes and let it go in a musical baritone.
I love a lassie, a bonny, bonny lassie. She's as pure as the lily in the dell.
No doubt.
She's as sweet as the heather, the bonny purple heather, Susan, my Worcestershire bluebell.
George extracted a photograph from the interior of the left side of his undervest and handed it to the specialist.
Ah, sounds like a nice girl. Is this she?
Yes, sir, that's my baby. No, sir, don't mean maybe. Yes, sir, that's my baby now. And by the way, when I meet that preacher, I shall say, yes, sir, that's my baby.
Quite.
If you knew Susie like I knew Susie.
Quite. Exactly. I shouldn't wonder. And now, what precisely is the trouble? No, don't sing it. Write the particulars on this piece of paper.
George did so.
You wish to woo, court, and become betrothed, engaged, affianced to this girl, yet you find yourself unable, incapable, incompetent, impotent, and powerless. Every time you attempt it, your vocal cords fail, fall short, are insufficient, wanting and go bluey. A not unusual case. I've had to deal with this sort of thing before. The effect of love on the vocal cords of even a normally eloquent subject is frequently deleterious. As regards the habitual stammerer, tests have shown that in 97.569 recurring of cases, the divine passion reduces him to a condition where he sounds like a soda wafer siphon trying to decite Gunga Din. I will tell you. Stammering is mainly mental and is caused by shyness, which is caused by the inferiority complex, which in turn is caused by suppressed desires or introverted inhibitions or something. The advice I give to all young men who come in here behaving like soda water siphons is to go out and make a point of speaking to at least 2 perfect strangers every day. Engage these strangers in conversation, persevering no matter how priceless a chump you may feel. And before many weeks are out, you will find that little daily dose has had its effects. Shyness will wear off, and with it, its stammer.
And having requested the young man, in the voice of the clearest timbre, free from all trace of impediment, to hand over a fee of
5 guineas.
the specialist sent George out into the world. The more George thought about the advice he'd been given,
The less I like it.
he shivered in the cab that took him to the station to catch the train back to East Wobsley. Like all shy young men, he had never hitherto looked upon himself as shy, preferring to attribute his distaste for the society of his fellows to
Some subtle rareness of soul.
But now that the thing had been put squarely up to him, he was compelled to realize that in all essentials he was a perfect rabbit. The thought of accosting perfect strangers and forcing his conversation upon them sickened him. But no mulliners ever shirked an unpleasant duty. As he reached the platform and strode along it to the train, his teeth were set. His eyes shone with an almost fanatical light of determination, and he intended, before his journey was over, to conduct 2 heart-to-heart chats if he had to sing every bar of them. Finding that the train would not start for some 10 minutes, George decided to pass the time by strolling up and down in the pleasant air. It was a lovely afternoon. The sun was gilding the platform with its rays, and a gentle breeze flew from the west. A little brook ran tinkling at the side of the road. Birds were singing in the hedgerows, and through the trees could be discerned dimly the noble facade of the county lunatic asylum. Soothed by his surroundings, George began to feel so refreshed that he regretted there was no one present whom he could engage in talk. It was at this moment that the distinguished-looking stranger entered the platform. The newcomer was a man of imposing physique, simply dressed in a plaid nightshirt, slippers, and a raincoat. In his hand, he carried an imaginary top hat, and into this he was dripping his fingers, taking them out and then waving them in a curious manner to right and left. He nodded so affably to George that the latter, though a little surprised at the other's costume, decided to speak. After all, he reflected, clothes do not make a man, and judging from the other's smile, a warm heart appeared to beat beneath that blue-green plaid nightshirt.
Nice weather.
Glad you like it. I ordered it special.
George was a little puzzled by this remark. He persevered.
Might I ask what you're doing
Doing?
with that hat?
Oh, with this hat. I see what you mean. Just scattering largesse to the multitude. Devil of a bore, but it's expected from a man in my position. The fact is, I'm the emperor of Abyssinia. That's my palace right over there. Don't let it go any farther. It's not supposed to be generally known.
It was with a rather sickly smile that George now endeavored to withdraw his arm from that of his companion, but the other would have none of this aloofness. He seemed to be in complete agreement with Shakespeare's dictum that a friend, when found, should be grappled to you with hooks of steel. He held George in a vice-like grip and drew him into a recess of the platform. He looked about him and seemed satisfied.
We are alone at last.
This fact had already impressed itself with sickening clearness on the What George could have done with it in the moment was a posse of police armed with stout clubs, and there was not even a dog in sight.
I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time.
Have you?
Yes. I want your opinion on human sacrifices.
I don't like them.
Why not?
It's hard to explain. I just don't.
Well, I think you're wrong. I know there's a school of thought growing up around here that holds your views, but I disapprove of them. I hate all this modern, advanced thought. Human sacrifices have always been good enough for the emperors of Abyssinia, and they're good enough for me. Kindly step in here, if you please.
He indicated the lamp and mop room at which they had now arrived. It was a dark and sinister apartment, smelling strongly of oil and porters, and was probably the last place on earth in which George would have wished to be closeted with a man of such peculiar views. He shrank back.
You go in first.
No larks?
Larks?
Yes, no pushing a fellow in and locking the door and squirting him with water through the window. I've had that happen to me before.
Certainly not.
Right. You're a gentleman. I'm a gentleman. Both gentlemen. Have you a knife, by the way? We shall need a knife.
No knife.
Ah, well, then we'll have to look about for something else. No doubt we shall manage.
And with the debonair manner which so became him, he scattered another handful of largesse and walked into the lamp room. I'm compelled to admit that had George been able to find the key, he would have locked the door without hesitation. Not being able to find the key, he had to be satisfied with banging it shut. This done, he leaped back and raced away down the platform. A confused noise within seemed to indicate that the emperor had become involved with some lamps. George made the best of the respite Covering the ground at a high rate of speed, he flung himself into the train and took refuge under the seat. There he remained, quaking. At one time he thought that his uncongenial acquaintance had gotten upon his track, for the door of the compartment opened and a cool wind blew in upon him. Then, glancing along the floor, he perceived feminine ankles. The relief was enormous. But even in his relief, George, who was the soul of modesty, did not forget his manners. He closed his eyes.
Porter,
Yes, ma'am?
what was all that disturbance as I came into the station?
Patient escaped from the asylum, ma'am.
Good gracious.
The voice would undoubtedly have spoken further, but at this moment the train began to move. There came the sound of a body descending upon a cushioned seat, and sometime later the rustling of a paper. The train gathered speed and jolted on. George had never traveled under the seat of a railway carriage before, and though he belonged to the younger generation, which is supposed to be so avid of new experiences, he had no desire to do so now. He decided to emerge and, if possible, to engage with a minimum of ostentation. Little as he knew of women, he was aware that, as a sex, they are apt to be startled by the sight of men crawling out from under the seats of compartments. He began his maneuvers by poking out his head and surveying the terrain. All was well. The woman, in her seat across the way, was engrossed in her paper. Moving in a series of noiseless wriggles, George extricated himself from his hiding place and, with a twist which would have been impossible for a man not in the habit of doing energization exercises daily before breakfast, heaved himself into the corner seat. The woman continued reading her paper. The events of the past quarter of an hour had tended rather to drive from George's mind the mission which he had undertaken on leaving the specialist's office. But now, having leisure for reflection, he realized that if he meant to complete his first day of the cure, he was allowing himself to run sadly behind schedule. Speak to 2 strangers, the specialist had told him, and up to the present he'd only spoken to 1. True, this one had been a pretty considerable stranger, and a less conscientious young man than George Mulliner might have considered himself justified in chalking him up on the scoreboard as 1.5 or even 2. But George had the dogged, honest Mulliner streak in him, and he refused to quibble. He nerved himself for action and cleared his throat. George was also feeling a little ill at ease. Women also increased his natural shyness. He never knew what to say to them. Then a happy thought struck him. He had just glanced at his watch and found the hour to be nearly 4:30. Women he knew loved a drop of tea at about this time, and fortunately there was in his suitcase a full thermos flask. He wanted to ask her if she would care for a cup of tea, but as so often happened with him in the presence of the opposite sex, he could get no further than a sort of sizzling sound like a cockroach calling to its young. The woman continued to stare at him. Her eyes were now about the size of regulation standard golf balls, and her breathing suggested the last stages of asthma. And it was at this point that George, struggling for speech, had one of those inspirations which frequently come to Mulliners. There flashed into his mind what the specialist had told him about singing. Say it with music, that was the thing to do. He delayed no longer.
T for 2 and 2 for tea, and me for you, and you for me.
He was shocked to observe his companion turning Nile green. He decided to make his meaning clearer.
I have a nice thermos, I have a full thermos, won't you share my thermos too? When skies are gray and you feel you are blue, tea sends the sun smiling through. I have a nice thermos, I have a full thermos, may I pour out some for you?
You will agree with me, I think, that no invitation could have been more happily put. But his companion was not responsive. With one last agonized look at him, she closed her eyes and sank back into her seat. Her lips had now turned a curious gray-blue color, and they were moving feebly. She reminded George, who, like myself, was a keen fisherman, of a newly gaffed salmon. The train was now approaching the dear old familiar East Wapsley country. George began to recognize landmarks. A wave of sentiment poured over him as he thought of Susan, and since sentiment always made him thirsty, he took his thermos out of the suitcase, unscrewed the top, and poured himself out a cup of tea. Then, placing the thermos on the seat, he drank. As you approach East Wobbly, the train has to round some sharp curves, and so violent is the sudden jerking that strong men have been known to spill their beer. George, forgetting this in his preoccupation, had placed the thermos only a few inches from the edge of the seat. The result was that, as the train rounded the first curve, the flask leaped like a live thing, dived to the floor, and exploded. The effect on the woman was dramatic. With a single piercing shriek, she rose from her seat straight into the air like a rocketing pheasant. And having clutched the emergency cord, fell back. Impressive as her previous leap had been, she excelled it now by several inches. There is widespread ignorance as to what precisely happens when an emergency cord is pulled. First, there comes a grinding noise as the brakes are applied. Then the train stops. And finally, from every point of the compass, a seething mob of interested onlookers begins to appear. Moreover, the train disgorges passengers from every door. To George, the crisis revealed himself immediately as one which he was totally incapable of handling. The one clear thought that stood out from the welter of his emotions was the reflection that it was advisable to remove himself, and to do so without delay. Drawing a deep breath, he shot swiftly off the mark. George ran now as he had never run before, and he had need to, for after the first instant of surprise, which enabled him to secure a lead, the whole mob was pouring across country after him. And dimly as he ran, he could hear voices in the throng informally discussing the advisability of lynching him. Moreover, the field through which he was running, a moment before a bare expanse of green, was now black with figures, headed by a man with a beard who carried a pitchfork. George swerved sharply to the right, casting a swift glance over his shoulder at his pursuers. He disliked them all, but especially the man with the pitchfork. It is impossible for one who is not an eyewitness to say how long the chase continued and how much ground was covered by the interested parties. George remembers
flitting past Farmer Higgins' pigsty and the dog and duck at Pondlebury Parva, and splashing through the brook Whipple at the point where it joins the river Wapple.
So we can safely assume that he got plenty of exercise. But the pleasantest of functions must end. And just as the setting sun was gilding the spire of the ivory-covered church of St. Barnabas the Resilient, a damp and bedraggled figure might have been observed crawling painfully along the high street of East Walmsley in the direction of the cozy little cottage, known to its builder as Chatsworth, and to the village tradesmen as Mulliners. Slowly George made his way to the familiar door, and passing through it, flung himself into his favorite chair. But a moment later, a more imperious need than the desire to rest forced itself upon his attention. Rising stiffly, he tottered to the kitchen and mixed himself a revivifying whiskey and soda. Then, refilling his glass, he returned to the sitting room to find that it was no longer empty. A slim, fair girl, tastefully attired in tailor-made tweeds, was leaning over the desk on which he kept his dictionary of English synonyms.
Why, Mr. Mulliner, what has been happening? Your clothes are torn, rent, ragged, tattered, and your hair is all disheveled, untrimmed, hanging loose, or negligently at loose ends.
You are right. And what is more, I am suffering from extreme fatigue, weariness, lassitude, exhaustion, prostration, and languor.
The girl gazed at him, a divine pity in her soft eyes.
I'm so sorry, so very sorry, grieved, distressed, afflicted, pained, mortified, dejected, and upset.
George took her hand. Her sweet sympathy had effected the cure for which he had been seeking so long. Coming on top of the violent emotions through which he'd been passing all day, it seemed to work on him like some healing spell, charm, or incantation. Suddenly, in a flash, he realized that he was no longer a stammerer. Had he wished at that moment to say,
P.N. Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers.
he could have done it without a second thought. But he had better things to say.
Miss Blake, Susan, Susie, it cannot have escaped your notice that I have long entertained towards you sentiments warmer and deeper than those of ordinary friendship. It is love, Susan, that has been animating my bosom. Love, first a tiny seed, has burgeoned in my heart, till, blazing into flame, it has swept away on the crest of its wave my diffidence, my doubt, my fears, and my foreboding. And now, like the topmost topaz of some ancient tower, it cries to all the world in that voice of thunder, "You are mine, my mate, predestined to me since time first began." As the star guides the mariner, when, battered by boiling billows, he hies him home to the haven of hope and happiness, so do you gleam upon me along life's rough road and seem to say, "Have courage, George, I am here." Susan, I am not an eloquent man. I cannot speak fluently as I could wish, but these simple words, which you have just heard, come from the heart, from the unspotted heart of an English gentleman. Susan, I love you. Will you be my wife? Married woman, matron, spouse, helpmeet, consort, partner, or better half?
Oh, George! Yes, yea, I. Decidedly, unquestionably, indubitably, uncontrovertibly, and past all dispute.
He folded her in his arms. And as he did so, there came from the street outside, faintly as from a distance, the sound of feet and voices. George leaped to the window and saw that rounding the corner, just by the Cow and Wheelbarrow public house, licensed to sell ales, wines, and spirits, was the man with the pitchfork, and behind him followed a vast crowd.
My darling, for purely personal and private reasons, into which I need not enter, I must now leave you. Will you join me later?
I will follow you to the ends of the earth.
It will not be necessary. I am only going down to the coal cellar. I shall spend the next half hour or so there. If anybody calls and asks for me, perhaps you would not mind telling them I am out.
I will. And George, by the way, what I really came here for was to ask you if you knew a word of 9 letters, signifying, ending in the K, and signifying an implement employed in the pursuit of agriculture.
Ah, pitchfork, sweetheart. But you may take it from me, as one who knows, that agriculture isn't the only thing it is used in pursuit of.